Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from Raus IAS Study Circle. Join the official Telegram channel of Raus IAS Study Circle to stay updated and get all the materials on the Telegram. The link to the channel can be found in the description box. Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified Supplement. Now in this analysis we shall take up the Hindu newspaper dated 7th November 2021, that is last Sunday, and also important articles which have appeared in the explained section of Indian Express in the second week of November. The news to be discussed has been displayed on your screen and time stamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So let's start our discussion from UPSC Prelims and Mains perspective. Now continuing our discussions on questions asked by UPSC in the Prelims of 2021, let's take up question number 13 from set A. Now this question is from the section of economy. It says, with reference to India, consider the following statements. First, retail investors through demat accounts can invest in treasury bills and Government of India debt bonds in primary market. Second, the negotiated dealing system order matching is a government securities trading platform of Reserve Bank of India. And third, the Central Depository Services Limited is jointly promoted by the Reserve Bank of India and Bombay Stock Exchange. So the question was, which of the statements given above are correct? Now as you can see, I have taken this aspect of retail direct and negotiated dealing system, which was also covered in the Prelims Compass magazine for the section of economy. Now interestingly, today one of the news is also with respect to retail direct, which has been initiated by RBI. And accordingly, the Prelims Compass magazine highlighted that presently the retail investors cannot directly buy government securities from RBI through e-Kuber platform. They can buy the GSECs, that is government security, indirectly through the facilitators such as banks, primary dealers, stock exchange, etc. So earlier, individual could not have directly bought these government securities from RBI. So now RBI has come up with a direct platform where citizens can directly buy from RBI. And in this regard, it also said that RBI is set to launch a new platform as Retail Direct to allow retail investors to buy government securities directly from RBI. So earlier citizen could not have bought these government securities directly from RBI, but now they can. And further, it also mentioned about the negotiated dealing system. It said that electronic platform created by RBI to deal in government securities acts as both primary and secondary market for government securities. Now this topic of direct retail and the fact that retail investors can buy government securities indirectly through aggregators, facilitators, etc. was also taken up in the economy section of Focus magazine in March 2021 edition under the chapter of government securities market. Now regarding retail direct, it also mentioned that in order to buy government securities, retail investors would be required to open their gilt accounts with the RBI similar to demat account for buying shares or bonds. So it's very much clear that participation of retail investors to buy government securities so far has been through the demat accounts. So let's go through the first two options. It says retail investors through demat account can invest in treasury bills and Government of India debt bonds in primary market. So yes, this is correct. Second, the negotiated dealing system order matching is a government securities trading platform of the Reserve Bank of India, as has been highlighted here. So this is also correct. However, this statement regarding the Central Depository Services Limited, which says that it is jointly promoted by Reserve Bank of India and Bombay Stock Exchange, is incorrect. As CDSL, that is Central Depository Services Limited, was promoted by Bombay Stock Exchange Limited jointly with leading banks such as SBI, Bank of India, Bank of Baroda, HDFC, Standard Chartered and Union Bank, but RBI was not involved. So the third option becomes incorrect. So had you gone through the Prelims Compass magazine on the section of economy, then you could have gone through this aspect of retail direct and also negotiated dealing system. So in this regard, the first and the second option becomes correct. So here the question was, which of the statements given above are correct? So the correct answer becomes 1 and 2 only. Now let's take up this news from the FAQ section which appeared on 7th November 2021. This news appeared on page number 11. Now this news highlighted about prompt corrective action. It says that how has RBI tweaked prompt corrective action norms for banks, and what will commercial banks under scrutiny need to do to get out of restrictions imposed by the central bank. Now, from my examination perspective, particularly Indian economy and also under GS paper 3, with respect to the aspect of economic development, this topic of prompt corrective action becomes important as it deals with the financial health of the bank, which the Reserve Bank of India continuously monitors. So, this news highlights about a recent guideline issued by the Reserve Bank of India with respect to prompt corrective action measures, which is a step to identify the banks which are financially weak and whose NPAs or non-performing assets have been deteriorating or increasing. Now, this circular includes the scheduled commercial bank but excludes small finance banks, payment banks, and also regional rural banks. So, this new circular or guideline of Reserve Bank of India on prompt corrective action does not include small finance banks, payment banks, and also regional rural banks. So, such scheduled commercial banks whose finances are weak are placed under the prompt corrective action framework of RBI. Now, this framework considers banks risky if the bank falls below on certain metrics or on certain indices. Now, so far, prompt corrective action was measured on four metrics or four indices, namely capital to risk asset ratio or capital adequacy ratio, which is as per the Basel norms. Now, here net non-performing asset means gross NPA minus provisioning requirements. Now, we will discuss in detail about provisioning requirements. Third, return on assets. Now, it simply means the profits of banks. And fourth, tier 1 leverage ratio. Now, when banks are placed under the prompt corrective action framework, the whole purpose is to monitor their financial health and also ensure that banks have enough capital so that they can at least carry on certain transactions on a daily basis. However, when banks are placed under the prompt corrective action framework, then some of their actions are also constrained or limited as per the guidelines of RBI. So the whole idea is to ensure enough capital and also to find out extent of rising NPAs of banks, that is bad loans or such loans which have been due for more than 90 days. So here first of all let us understand about capital adequacy ratio and tier 1 leverage ratio. So capital adequacy ratio means tier 1 capital of a bank along with tier 2 capital of a bank divided by the risk weighted assets of a bank. Now the risk weighted assets means exposure of a bank against risk which a bank is willing to take. Now this risk weighted assets differ across sectors, and it also means that RWA, that is risk weighted asset, is different with respect to different loans given by the bank. So this is with respect to capital adequacy ratio. So here the bank is required to maintain enough capital or adequate capital based on this particular formula. Now to calculate capital adequacy ratio, tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital of the bank divided by risk weighted assets into 100. So this gives us the capital adequacy ratio. However, with respect to tier 1 leverage ratio, as the name itself suggests, it is tier 1 capital divided by total assets of bank. And here banks need not assign risk associated with each loan. Now the capital or assets of a bank can be categorized as either tier 1 capital or tier 2 capital. So tier 1 capital includes paid up capital, that is ordinary shares or statutory reserves and other disclosed free reserves, perpetual non-cumulative preference shares which are eligible to be included within tier 1 capital, perpetual debt instruments which are eligible to be included within tier 1 capital, capital reserves representing surplus arising out of sale proceeds of assets for the banks, and banks may also include certain quarterly, half-yearly profits for computation of Tier 1 capital. But these profits must be audited by statutory auditors. So these are some of the examples of Tier 1 capital, whereas Tier 2 capital includes undisclosed reserves, revaluation reserves, general provisions and loss reserves, hybrid debt capital instruments, subordinated debt and investment reserve accounts. So both these ratios helps in identifying whether a bank should be placed within the PCA framework or not. Now, as per the RBI guidelines, it has asked banks to maintain capital adequacy ratio of 9%. However, according to Basel Norms 3, it has asked banks to maintain capital adequacy ratio of 8%. Now, apart from capital adequacy ratio, the Basel III norms also provides the banks to maintain capital conservation buffer ratio of 2.5%. Now, capital conservation buffer is an additional layer of security for banks, and banks have to maintain 2.5% of total risk-weighted assets as capital conservation buffer. So the Basel III norms ask the commercial banks to maintain capital adequacy ratio of 8% and capital conservation buffer of 2.5%, which overall results in maintaining an additional capital of 10.5%. However, with respect to Indian banks, as per the guidelines of RBI, it has suggested to maintain CAR of 9% along with capital conservation buffer ratio of 2.5%. So overall, in India, we have an additional 1% security as suggested by Basel III norms. Now here we also mentioned about a second parameter known as net non-performing assets, where we discussed that net non-performing asset means gross NPA minus the provisioning requirements. So now let us understand about the provisioning requirements. Now, provisioning coverage ratio can be said to be percentage of funds which is to be set aside by the banks to cover prospective losses due to bad loans or NPAs, as this amount which has been set aside by the bank helps to cover risk arising from NPAs. So, the provisioning requirement may differ for different NPAs because NPAs are also categorized based on their repayment of loan. So a loan can be categorized as NPAs if it is due for more than 90 days, that is 3 months. And depending on the due period, NPAs can be categorized as number 1, substandard assets, number 2, doubtful assets, and number 3, lost assets. Now, as a substandard assets, it means that loan is due for more than 90 days but less than a year. Now, NPAs are considered as doubtful assets when the loan is due for more than 1 year. And an NPA is considered as lost asset when the loan has not been repaid back and accordingly loss has been identified by the bank or RBI and this loan has not been written off completely. So these are the different types of NPAs categorized by RBI. So based on these different NPAs, even the provisioning requirements differ. So overall, provisioning requirements means certain part of the profit of the bank which has to be set aside to cover these losses because of these rising NPAs or because of these different kinds of NPAs. Now these provisioning requirements or provisioning coverage ratio differs for substandard assets, doubtful assets, and also lost assets, and also for regular loans. So provisioning coverage ratio says that it means percentage of funds to be set aside by the bank to cover prospective losses due to bad loans. And overall, it helps to cover risk rising from NPAs, that is non-performing assets. Now, as per the new guidelines of RBI, the third aspect, that is return on assets with respect to profitability of bank, has been removed as one of the indices from prompt corrective action. So as of now, when a bank is placed under prompt corrective action framework, then only there are 3 indices to check out for. That is capital adequacy ratio of the bank, non-net performing assets of the bank, and tier 1 leverage ratio of the bank. Now, as I had stated that there are certain restrictions on a bank when it is placed under prompt corrective action. Now, under the PCA framework, the risk has been divided into three parts. So it talks about risk 1 threshold, risk threshold 2, and risk threshold 3. So under risk threshold 1, banks are restricted on distribution of dividend or remittances of profits. So this is what the bank cannot do. Further, promoters, owners or parent in case of foreign banks must bring in capital for the bank. Now when a bank is placed under risk 2 of PCA framework, then in addition to these mandatory actions under threshold 1, the bank is restricted to expand its branches either in India or in overseas or in foreign countries. And when a bank is placed under risk threshold 3 of PCA framework, then along with risk 1 and risk 2 restrictions, appropriate restrictions are also placed on the bank with respect to capital expenditure, which must be done only with the approval of the board. However, technological upgradation are allowed for the banks. So these are some of the mandatory actions with respect to PCA framework. However, it also talks about discretionary actions which RBI can take. So the discretionary actions which the RBI can take includes special supervisory action, actions pertaining to strategy, actions pertaining to governance, actions pertaining to the capital of the bank, credit risk related action, market risk related action, HR related action, actions related to profitability of the bank, actions related to operations or business of the bank, or any other action as the RBI may take. So these are some of the restrictions which has been imposed as per the new framework for prompt corrective action. Now based on our discussion, let's take up these two previous questions asked by UPSC in the prelims examination. The question asked in 2018 was, consider the following statements. First, capital adequacy ratio is the amount that banks have to maintain in the form of their own funds to offset any loss that banks incur if the account holders fail to repay dues. Yes, this statement is correct. Second, CAR is decided by each individual bank. No, this statement is incorrect as it is decided by RBI. So question was, which of the statements given above are correct? So here the correct answer was A, that is one only. Now question was also asked with respect to Basel III Accord in 2015. So the question was, Basel III Accord or simply Basel III, often seen in the news, seeks to. Now in this, apart from option B, the three options were with respect to developing national strategies for conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, reducing greenhouse gases, and also transfer of technology to replace the use of chlorofluorocarbons. So here the correct answer was B, that is to improve banking sector's ability to deal with financial and economic stress and improve risk management. So we see that questions have been asked by UPSC on CAR and also Basel III. So in future, question can also be asked on provisioning requirement or NPAs or kind of NPAs or any of the steps taken by RBI, especially with respect to putting banks under prompt corrective action framework. Thus this news becomes important mainly from the perspective of GS paper 3 under Indian economy. With this, let's take up the next news for discussion. Now the next news appears on page number 7. It says China strengthening connectivity in Chumbi Valley. United States report says that Beijing continues to take incremental and tactical actions to press its claim along the line of actual control. Now as you can see in this map, this is the location of Chumbi Valley and it is very close to the Siliguri corridor, which stretches to approx 22 kilometers. Now this stretch has great significance for the security of the country as this is the only gateway to the northeast. So China is increasing its presence along the Chumbi Valley and it is also constructing roads and also recruiting the locals into its army. And this report was also highlighted by United States Department of Defense in its 2021 annual report, which it submitted to United States Congress on military security developments on PRC, that is People's Republic of China. Now in its report, it has stated that China has pressed its claim along LAC and it is also building an alternative access close to Siliguri. Now these developments have further raised eyebrows in the Indian Army, especially after Doklam standoff and also after the recent clashes in the Galwan Valley. So in this news, you must know the location of Chumbi Valley and also the strategic importance of the Siliguri corridor, as it is a gateway to northeast. And in this stretch of 22 kilometers, various infrastructures have been laid, such as road, railways, pipelines, offshore cables, etc. So the Chinese army can easily target this Siliguri corridor. Further, it is through this corridor important economic activity with respect to trade take place. Another concern is that some of the roads and railways are very close to LAC, and also the fact that this Siliguri corridor links India to Nepal, Bangladesh and Bhutan on three sides. So in this news you must know about the location of Chumbi Valley. An increasing presence of Chinese army along the Chumbi Valley can be said to be a security concern for India. Thus, from your mains perspective, this topic becomes important under GS paper 3, especially with respect to security, that is, role of external state and non-state actors in creating challenges to internal security. And in your prelims, question can be asked with respect to the location of Chumbi Valley. With this, let's take up the next news for analysis.
Now there is an article in the Hindu which talks about where does India stand on methane emission. Now this topic is very important from the fact that recently there has been a conference which is going on which is called as United Nations Climate Change Conference, which is also called as COP26, which is taking place at Glasgow. Now, two important contributors of methane, especially the US and the European Union, have actually signed a pledge in which they are going to reduce the emission of methane by good 30% by the year 2030 from the 2020 level. Now, this is considered to be global methane pledge, and the interesting aspect is 90 countries have signed this agreement. At the same time, both India and China have chosen to abstain from this meeting. In this regard, we'll try to understand why methane emission is a cause of concern and why India didn't participate in this pledge. Now, here we need to understand that methane emissions have increased 9% in this particular decade. And this is actually very important considering the fact that methane emission is triggered by multiple things. This includes farming activity, animal rearing, burning of fossil fuels, and also methane emission has increased because a lot of methane which was trapped in permafrost and in ocean floor is also getting released because of climate change or global warming. So this is something which is an alarming situation. Now, second important aspect is methane accounts for around 20% of global greenhouse gas emission. Now, this is something which may not look very bad, but the fact is this is coupled by another fact that methane is 25 times more potent in trapping the heat in comparison to CO2. So this particular aspect makes methane an immediate enemy of humanity. If we want to control warming of the planet, then the first attention should be paid to methane by reducing its emission. Now, the next important aspect is, as already mentioned, methane emissions is triggered by anthropogenetic reasons, which I have already highlighted in terms of burning of fossil fuels, farming activity, animal rearing, and also release of methane from beds. But when we talk about the impact of methane, there are three important impacts. Now, the first impact is the climate itself. As already mentioned, whenever we increase methane in the atmosphere, it leads to global warming because its capacity to retain heat is much higher than that of carbon dioxide. Second, when you talk about health, it is also a pollutant and it also damages lungs. And this can cause multiple diseases in humans, which include bronchitis and trigger asthma. Apart from that, when you talk about the crops, methane is harmful for crops as well because it reduces the health of the plant by reducing their ability to photosynthesize and absorb carbon, and this impacts their crop yield. So we can see here that methane is actually an enemy which we all should actually counter. Now let's take a look into India's position in terms of emission of greenhouse gas, that is methane. Now, as it is already evident that India is the third largest emitter of methane in the world, and the primary reasons is the rural nature of economy in terms of the farming activity, and also methane is emitted by the cattle. Now you must be aware of the fact that India has the largest population of cattle, so both these factors contribute very significantly in terms of emission of methane in the atmosphere. Now, when we talk about this entire situation, it seems that India should do something. Now, what India is trying to do, India is trying to do a very different approach. We are planning to actually capture the methane that we are emitting. And for this particular purpose, Government of India has established a Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. Now, the basic idea of this ministry is to invest heavily in the national strategy to increase biogas production and reduce methane emission. So, this is something which they want to do in terms of capturing methane and utilizing them in terms of satisfying the energy needs. Now, the second important aspect is India is also trying to change its forest management, which is a very important aspect in terms of how we can control the emission of methane. So, what India is trying to do, India is trying to go for commercial plantation. Apart from that, we are also going for infrastructure development in the forest land. Now, if we sign such kind of pledge, this kind of activity will become very difficult to implement, and that is why India is not very willing to sign such kind of pledge. The third important aspect is actually the goal that we have. We wish to cover around 33% of India's area with forest. Now, the current status is that we have somewhere 22 to 23% of the area covered under forest. Now, if we actually increase this level from 22 23% to 33%, which is our target, then it will be actually a great carbon sink of its own. One estimate is that if India is going to implement something like this, then we are going to absorb around 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide. Now, this is a very significant number, and this is the reason why India is not very willing to sign global pledge on methane. Now, one of the things that we need to understand is that whenever we go for any kind of pledge, there are some clause which are actually going against India's position. So what these clauses are, we need to understand that as well. Now, one of the clauses says very clearly that if we are going to go into this kind of a pledge, then we cannot get into international trade for the services that we are going to create for this kind of methane emission reduction. So this is something which goes against the basic plan. So we plan to capture methane, we plan to actually change the forest management, we also plan to increase the forest area by good 50%, and for this particular purpose, India should stay away from this pledge. The second important aspect is if this pledge is signed, the international trade falls under the ambit of World Trade Organization, and you must be aware of the fact that India is a member of World Trade Organization. So if we sign such kind of a pledge, it will become detrimental to our interest whenever we go for any kind of international trade. This is the reason why India has stayed away from this particular pledge. I hope it is now clear to you that why India has taken this stand. Now, there is an article in Indian Express which talks about land races. But in order to understand this article from the perspective of UPSC examination, we need to first talk about the problems of green revolution. Now, whenever we talk about green revolution, one of the key features of green revolution is the inclusion of high yielding variety seeds. Now, when we are talking about high yielding variety seeds, they have their own set of problems that we need to understand. First and foremost, they promote monoculture. Now, monoculture is a form of agriculture in which on large tract of land we grow same crop, which actually leads to lack of genetic diversity. Now, when you talk about this entire situation, it means that on large tracts of land, either wheat or rice or similar crop of high yielding variety variant is grown. Now, this actually creates some problem as well. What kind of problem? Let's understand. Now, just imagine a situation in which a particular area monoculture has been practiced. So whenever we are practicing monoculture, there is a problem which is actually always lurking. That is, there can be a variant of insects which can cause huge damage to this particular crop. And since we do not have technical availability in terms of what we can do to counter that, there is a possibility that it may lead to a challenge to food security. So this is one of the problems that we see from high yielding varieties. Similarly, this problem is related to the idea of lack of genetic diversity as well. Now, when we talk about high yielding varieties basically are grown in lab conditions in which we cross various features of seeds to get features which are in line with the requirement of food security, whether we talk about or what is the time it takes to mature, or in terms of nutrients as well. But this lack of genetic diversity gets manifested over a period of time. So we are not very sure how this lack of genetic diversity will actually manifest. The third aspect about we should talk about in terms of high yielding variety seeds is they require irrigation and other inputs like fertilizers. Now, in terms of irrigation and fertilizer, we need to understand that this is something which leads to a problem which is called as environmental stress. Now we know that as climate change is coming up as a big challenge, now as the climate changes, there are many things that we have observed. So we have observed that the duration of rainy season has shrunk. Apart from that, there are other features which change as well, like humidity or sunshine, which actually causes environmental stress. So if there is any change in terms of inputs for irrigation or fertilizer, what will happen? These high yielding variety seeds will not be in a position to perform at the top level. In a nutshell, we can say that these crops are basically incapable of handling environmental stress because they require a lot of inputs, only then they can survive. And this basically leads to the bigger problem in terms of challenges that we can see in terms of food security in the time to come. So as we see, the newer type of pests are coming up which are actually immune to the kind of insecticides or pesticides that we use. In future there can be a challenge to food security, so we should actually look for variant of seeds in terms of which are in a position to handle this environmental stress. And what is the solution to this problem? The solution of this problem is land races. Now land race is a system in which the seeds are basically taken which are free of human intervention. So this is one of the important aspects. We need to understand what land races is. So if we wish to define what land races are defined as dynamic population of cultivated plants with historical origin. Now here the important aspect is that these plants must be native to this particular area for a longer duration. Now the aspect that we wish to highlight that this plant has all genes necessary in order to cope with the environmental stress of this particular region. Second important aspect is they should have distinct identity, which means that we are not propagating monoculture. So different regions and areas will have different land races seeds which have distinct identity and which lead to what? Genetically diverse and locally adapted and associated with set of farmers practices of seed selection and field management. Now here we need to understand that in different farm areas, different practices are being implemented. Now these practices are based on the kind of temperature, rainfall, humidity, and also period of maturity. Now since different agriculture area have different kind of settings for temperature, rainfall, humidity and period of maturity, with local farmers knowledge we can definitely appreciate that and do it in the best format. The second important aspect of land races plants to breeding is that it is more efficient in nutrient uptake and utilization. Now here we need to understand that the kind of high yielding variety seeds that we use, these HYV seeds require inputs in terms of fertilizers and they're not very efficient to pick nutrients from the soil directly. Now when we are looking for land races plants which actually have useful genes which are adapted to this kind of a stressful environments, they can get the best out of the situation in which they are grown. So this is a very important aspect or feature of land races. Third important aspect is land races are important genotypes for crop breeding owing to their high potential to adapt to specific environmental condition. Now when we talk about land races, it is not that we are talking about one particular crop in one particular region. Now there is a possibility that there are land race seeds which are grown in a particular area. Now these seeds can be transported to some other area as well without compromising the quality or yield. So this kind of a transportation is a very important facet in which we can actually move seeds from one particular region to other just to ensure that similar positive conditions are there for maximum cultivation and maintaining food security in long run. Now one of the features that we talk about land races is that they may not produce as much of food as we see in terms of commercial cultivators using high yielding varieties. But over a period of time, it has been seen that they have become an important sources of genetic variability, which is very important in terms of nutrient enrichment of crops. Apart from that, in the search for genes of tolerance and resistance, we have talked about environmental stress. These land races are better suited for this kind of a cultivation that we are seeing. Owing to that, lot of work has gone into land races of seeds or protecting the genetic pool or genetic diversity of seeds. In this context, the article has been written. Now, Rahibai Popore, who is also known as Seed Mother, received her Padma Shri for the effort she has done in terms of saving hundreds of land races or wild varieties of commonly grown crops at the village level. Now, here there are few things that you must understand, that there's a body by the name of BAIF which has initiated a community-led program to preserve the land races. Now, when we talk about land races, we are aware of the fact that these are now conserved in areas which are like in remote rural areas or in tribal pockets where the invasion of high yielding varieties is not complete, and that is why we need to understand that these places are also depleting because of or lack of proper conservation. Now, here we must also remember that the efforts of Rahibai Papare has brought rich dividends. She has been in a position to save 114 land races of 40 crops. So this is an effort done by the organization for which she works, and this is an important aspect that you must remember as a fact for prelims examination.
The next news to be taken up appears in the explained section of Indian Express. It says, what are the two initiatives of the RBI that Prime Minister Modi has launched? Now, these two initiatives are, number one, the RBI Retail Direct Scheme, which we have already discussed in our Prelims 2021 discussion, and the Reserve Bank Integrated Ombudsman Scheme. Now, this news says that RBI Retail Direct Scheme is aimed towards enhancing access to the government securities market for retail investors, that is individuals, while the Reserve Bank Integrated Ombudsman Scheme aims to improve the grievance redressal mechanism for resolving customer complaints against entities regulated by RBI. And in this regard, the RBI has integrated three ombudsman schemes. So first of all, let us understand about government security and about the RBI Retail Direct Scheme. Then we will come back to this topic of the Reserve Bank Integrated Ombudsman Scheme. Now, the points we have already discussed, that now individuals will be allowed to directly open and maintain retail direct gilt accounts with RBI, almost similar to the Demat accounts. And this RDG account or retail direct gilt account can be opened through an online portal provided for the purpose of this scheme. So this online portal will also give registered users the following facilities, namely access to primary issuance of government securities and access to NDSOM, which is the electronic platform of RBI. Now, after understanding about retail direct scheme of RBI, let us first of all understand the basics with respect to government security. So it says that a government security is a tradable instrument issued by the central government or the state governments. So the government securities are either issued by the central government or by the state government. And these government securities acknowledges government's debt obligation. That is, the government has to repay back certain amount to the public. And such securities can be divided into short-term security or long-term securities. Now, these short-term securities are generally for less than 1 year. And these short-term securities are usually called the treasury bills with original maturities of less than a year. And the long-term securities have maturity of 1 year or more and are generally referred as the government bonds or dated securities. So the central government issues both the short-term security and the long-term security, that is treasury bills and also bonds or dated securities, where treasury bills are the short-term securities and bonds and dated securities are the long-term securities. Whereas state governments issue only bonds or dated securities, which are called the state development loans. Now, another important point is that the government securities carry practically no risk of default because it has been guaranteed by the government, hence are also called risk-free gilt-edged instruments. And because of the instruments being risk-free, Hence, more people want to buy the government securities because it has no risk of default. Another question is that how are these government securities issued? So these government securities are issued through auctions conducted by RBI, and these auctions are conducted on electronic platform called eKuber, the core banking solution platform of RBI. Now, as we have already seen that the scheduled banks, primary dealers, insurance company, etc., whoever maintain accounts with RBI are members of this electronic platform, that is eKuber, and so far individuals could not transact through the eKuber, as now the RBI has come up with RBI Retail Direct Scheme, whereby the individuals can open and maintain Retail Direct Gilt account. So it says that all members of eKuber can place their bids in the auction through this electronic platform, and this is how generally GSEC is issued. So the question is that what are the benefits for individual to directly open an account with the RBI, especially with respect to retail direct scheme? So first of all is regarding the retail investors, that is individuals. As we have discussed that these government securities are risk-free investment, so it will allow more people to open such accounts directly with the RBI. Further, these accounts are held in demat format and can be easily sold in secondary market to meet immediate cash requirements. So these securities are also liquid in nature, that is, they can be easily converted into cash. Further, these securities can also be used as collateral to borrow loans. So these can be said to be some of the benefits for the retail investors. Regarding government, now the government has planned to borrow around rupees 12 lakh crores from the market for the present financial year. Now allowing individuals to open direct account with the RBI will make it easier for the government to mobilize household funds or household deposits in order to undertake long-term investment, as the money which will be taken by the government can then be repaid back to the people after a longer duration of time. And it will also propel people to invest more in government securities, and this will overall help to deepen the government security market, and this will lead to higher investments in India and will also promote economic growth. So these can be said to be some of the benefits with respect to the retail direct scheme launched by RBI. Now, in order to make the redressal mechanism more simple and also more responsive, RBI has integrated the three ombudsman scheme into one, namely the integrated ombudsman scheme of 2021. These three ombudsman scheme were banking ombudsman scheme of 2006, Ombudsman Scheme for Non-Banking Financial Companies of 2018, and Ombudsman Scheme for Digital Transaction 2019. Now, how this will benefit? It will help to improve the grievance redressal mechanism by resolving customer complaints against RBI's regulated entities. Now, this scheme will help to achieve the idea of one nation, one ombudsman, with one portal, one email, and one address for the customers to launch their complaints. So the whole redressal mechanism has been made more simple, and the customers will be able to file their complaints, submit their documents, track the status of redressal, and also provide feedback through this email address. Further, the RBI has also provided a multilingual toll-free number which will provide all relevant information on grievous redressal. Now, since the RBI has integrated or combined three different ombudsman schemes, so the question becomes that what are the institutions that this integrated ombudsman scheme will cover? So it says that it will cover all commercial banks, regional rural banks, scheduled primary urban cooperative banks, and also non-scheduled primary urban cooperative banks having deposit size of rupees 50 crore and above as on the date of audited balance sheet of the previous financial year. Then it will cover all non-banking financial companies excluding housing finance companies. Now these non-banking financial companies which are authorized to accept deposits, NBFCs which have customer interface, and the NBFCs having asset size of rupees 100 crores and above as on the date of audited balance sheet of the previous financial year, and all system participants as defined under the scheme. Now system participant has been explained under the Payment and Settlement Systems Act of 2007. Now according to this act, system participant means any bank or any other person participating in a payment system, and also includes the system provider. So all these entities are covered under the integrated ombudsman scheme of RBI. Thus, this news becomes important both from our prelims and mains perspective. And from your mains, this topic gets covered under GS paper 3, especially with respect to economic development. The last article to be taken up also appears in the explained section. It says that how Srinagar earned the UNESCO creative tag. Now, this news highlights that Srinagar has become one of the 49 cities worldwide to join the UNESCO Creative Cities Network. Now, this news must be seen from the perspective of art and culture from the prelims and in the mains under GS1, especially with respect to Indian heritage and culture. So, Srinagar has now become one of the 49 cities worldwide to join UNESCO Creative Cities Network. Now, this news further says that the Indian National Commission for Cooperation with UNESCO had recommended name of two cities to be included in the list, namely that of Gwalior and also Srinagar. However, it was only Srinagar which was included in the UNESCO Creative Cities Network. Now, from your prelims perspective, you must know that the Indian National Commission for Cooperation with UNESCO functions under the Ministry of Education. The news further says that there are other 5 cities of India which are part of this list. These cities are Mumbai for film, Hyderabad for gastronomy, Chennai for music, Varanasi for music, and Jaipur for crafts and folk art. Now, the UNESCO Creative Cities Network was created in 2004, and this aims to foster international cooperation across cities of the world which invest in culture and creativity as accelerators of sustainable development. Now, if you go through the sustainable development goals, then you see that goal number 11 talks about sustainable cities and communities. So, in this regard, it says that to achieve the 2030 agenda of sustainable development, cities can use culture and creativity as drivers to reinforce creative economy, social harmony, human development, technological innovation, and also scientific development approaches for the development of the cities. And cities across the world are included under the UNESCO Creative Cities Network based on these 7 creative fields, which includes crafts and folk art, design, film, gastronomy, literature, media arts, and music. Thus, the whole idea behind including cities under UNESCO Creative Cities Network is to foster culture and creativity. And in this regard, Srinagar has been included in the list for 2021. Now, Srinagar, apart from its tourism, is also famous for its various handicraft products such as textiles, carpets, rugs, crewel embroidery, silverware, woodwork, and also papier mâche. Now, papier mâche, which is an art form of Kashmir, uses pulp or paper. So, along with tourism and because of these handicraft products, Srinagar has been included within the UNESCO Creative Cities Network of 2021. Thus, this news becomes important mainly from your prelims perspective, and in this news, you need to know the Indian cities which has been included in the UNESCO Creative Cities Network, which includes Srinagar, Mumbai, Hyderabad, Chennai, Varanasi, and Jaipur. And the Indian National Commission for Cooperation with UNESCO functions under the Ministry of Education. Now, based on our discussion, this becomes your practice question for the day, which says China is strengthening connectivity and increasing its depth in Chumbi Valley, close to India's strategic and vulnerable corridor along. Options are A. Galwan Valley, B. Kalapani, C. Siliguri, and D. Sabroom. Now, coming to the answer of yesterday, the question was consider the following statements about Joint Parliamentary Committee. First, JPC is constituted every year by the Lok Sabha to probe matters against national interest. No, JPC is an ad hoc committee and not constituted every year. Second, JPC is authorized to collect evidence in oral or written form or demand documents in connection with the matter which is being investigated. Yes, this is correct. And third, if a witness fails to appear before a JPC in response to summons, his or her conduct constitutes contempt of the House. Yes, this is also correct. So the question was which of the statements given above is correct. So here the correct answer becomes B, that is 2 and 3 only. With this, we come to an end to today's analysis. Thank you for watching DNS Supplement for the second week of November 2021.